Right. Now that everybody's had a couple minutes to come in, just wanted to thank you again for joining us. I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everybody so much for attending. This is our virtual community meeting on the Equity, Recovery, Connectivity, and Growth Framework for Caltrain. My name is Ryan McCauley. I'm on the Government and Community Affairs team for Caltrain. Before we begin, we just want to set a few housekeeping items and sort of meeting logistics. This presentation, along with the equity framework itself, is actually posted online. It's actually two places. So it's at caltrain2040.org/equity. And then it's also on our main Caltrain site, caltrain.com, and then Caltrain business plan, caltrain.com/business plan. We've translated the policy into Spanish and Chinese as well. And just to let you know, this presentation is being dual cast on YouTube. So we'll be monitoring chat comments there as well. But if you have a specific question and you want it answered, it's a little bit easier for us to looking at Zoom. So, I encourage you to try to use that if you can. But as it's being recorded on YouTube, it'll archive itself there as well. Just so you know, everybody is currently muted. During the presentation, we will have staff answering questions via the Q&A function. If you type your question in there by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little pop-up window where you can type your question. You can choose to ask your question anonymously. If you do not select that box, your name will be displayed to all the other attendees when it's answered by staff. At the end of our presentation, we'll immediately enter into a feedback section. So during that feedback portion, you can continue to ask questions through the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand virtually. I'm sure most of you are all Zoom pros by now, but staff will call on individuals with raised hands to provide their comment verbally. To raise your hand, you can click the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen, or if you're calling in, you can press *9. Once you are called on, you will see a little pop-up that confirms your request to be unmuted. Due to time constraints and making sure we want to get everybody's comments, we will limit comments to about 3 minutes. And again, we can kind of play this by ear depending on how many people are there, how many comments we have, but we just want to give everybody a chance to contribute. All of the documentation and the presentations, they're all online and can help provide some context to this. And again, that website is caltrain2040.org/equity, or our main caltrain.com/business plan site. If you have comments or questions about the framework, you can email us at equity@caltrain.com. You can also leave a voicemail at 650-508-6499. All this information will also be displayed at the end of the presentation. And so before we get started, we just wanted to start with a couple poll questions just to see sort of who's joining us tonight, how many of you are sort of familiar with the process. So those should be popping up on your screen now. So we'll give a couple minutes. Unfortunately, for those of you joining us on YouTube, you won't be able to see it, but we'll sort of give a report out. So we'll give everybody a couple minutes for the poll questions. All right, so it looks like most people have answered. Maybe give it another 15 seconds if you're thinking really hard about your answers. We don't want you to answer incorrectly. All right, so I'm going to end the poll, and I'll share. So as you can see, we have a pretty good mix. A lot of people were pretty regularly driving or riding Caltrain a few times a year. As far as people, what county? A majority, 56%, are coming from San Francisco, and then San Mateo and Santa Clara representing as well. And then a lot of people accessing by transit, which is awesome, taking a bus or maybe light rail to Caltrain. So that's great to see. So awesome. Thank you so much for that. And so lastly, just so you know, we are recording this meeting, and it will be archived on our YouTube page once it's over. We'll also add it to our Caltrain site. So, you know, if you missed it or you are here and you want to share it out, we'll have that as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. And without further ado, here is Sebastian Petty, the project manager.
Good evening, and as Ryan said, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to share your thoughts with Caltrain and your interest in terms of what we're doing. So my name is Sebastian Petty. I'm been the manager of the Caltrain business plan process. I'm also the deputy chief of planning for Caltrain. And the presentation that I'll provide tonight will provide some background on the equity, connectivity, recovery, and growth framework. And then I'll walk through the framework itself. As Ryan mentioned, folks are totally welcome to provide their questions in the Q&A as we go. If they're more straightforward ones, we'll hopefully answer them as we're going. If they're more complicated ones, there may be ones that we get to at the end when we're sort of in the Q&A section. And so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and run through a brief PowerPoint here. So the focus of tonight's meeting is on the draft equity, connectivity, recovery, and growth framework, and we'll get to that shortly. Before doing that, I did want to just provide a couple quick general updates on how COVID-19 is impacting Caltrain and what the future looks like for us. So this is a diagram that we've been using to kind of just talk about how the pandemic relates to Caltrain and our progress through it. The first couple months of the pandemic in March through really May of 2020, we were kind of in triage mode, very focused on making sure that our customers and operators were as safe as they could be. We cut our service down pretty low. Since May, we've been really sort of in a mode where we're just trying to kind of make it through the pandemic, frankly. There's been some very serious financial impacts to Caltrain. We're operating service at a time where our demand is greatly reduced. We're at about 5% of our pre-COVID demand. That's been hugely challenging for us as we rely on ticket sales to cover most of our operating costs. We're also operating during a period where we're not sure what's going to really happen with demand. Obviously, as caseloads are spiking in many parts of the country and reopenings are pausing or in some cases reversing, it's unlikely that we're going to see major increases in ridership soon. So we anticipate that we'll be in this period from really May of this year through sometime next year, likely. Where we may be reducing or changing service a number of times, where we know that we're going to be operating in conditions where we're having to think about things like social distancing and just really in a very unusual period of operation. Finally, somewhere beyond 2021, where we know that the pandemic will resolve through vaccines or other kinds of treatments. And we're also doing some work at Caltrain to think about what our future in that next reality might look like. We're hoping it's back to normal or back to an improved version of normal, but it's this is a major event really across the world, and so the future may look a little different than it did at the start of this year. Just briefly on the financial consequences for Caltrain, and this is sort of tangentially related to what's been in the news, so worth my spending a few minutes on. So as I mentioned, Caltrain has been really hugely financially challenged as a result of the pandemic. We do rely heavily on ridership and ticket sales to cover our operating costs. Without those, there's really a huge gap, and we don't have an underlying dedicated source of funding that creates a huge reservoir we can draw on. So right now we're subsisting on federal aid money. We received an initial tranche of that. This was the CARES Act funding that came into the region and then now has been distributed through MTC. And so that's really what we're relying on. That money is being divvied up in the region by a blue ribbon task force. We anticipate that we'll receive another $15 million or so in the second tranche of that allocation. And we're hopeful that would get us through the end of the calendar year. Unfortunately, given what's happening with caseloads and ridership, it's unlikely that that's going to carry us all the way to the end of the year. And so we are anticipating that we're going to really hit a place where we have some pretty major financial challenges somewhere in sort of the mid to late fall. So what does major financial challenges means? Well, as we've been operating under the CARES Act and with the CARES Act funding, we've avoided having any sort of layoffs or deeper cuts. Once that funding is exhausted, if there isn't any additional federal funding, then we are going to have to start looking at some pretty severe service cuts, potentially up into including possibly shutting down revenue service. We obviously don't want to do that, and so we're working very hard to analyze a whole range of different service options, including higher levels of service. Between the 70 trains we were running today and the 92 train level we ran pre-COVID. We're looking at things like absolute minimum levels of service, which should be around the 40 trains per weekday and probably shutting down service on the weekend. And then, as I mentioned, we are unfortunately having to think about what it would look like if we were to fully shut down the Caltrain service. One of the reasons that's being talked about is that railroads, unlike a bus system, we can't really scale our service and scale our costs in a linear way. We're generally high fixed cost businesses, so if we were to cut 20% of our trains, we would not necessarily cut 20% of our costs, and so it's a little bit unclear if we're going to be able to make it to a place where we're going to be able to cut our way to prosperity. So a very challenging situation. In terms of the work we're doing to make sure that we don't end up in that situation, we're exploring a whole range of options that includes expanded federal advocacy for more federal funds, working with our member agencies to look at ways they may be able to increase contributions. We're talking about things like monetization of assets, and also beginning to think about new public and private sector partners. SB 797, which is the sales tax revenue that would support Caltrain dedicated funding, has been in the news quite a bit, and I'm not going to get into that extensively other than to say something of that nature is important in the long term to ensure that there's sort of reliable sources of funding or financial viability for Caltrain. So some of you may have been following the Caltrain business planning process, and it's been a kind of a several years of work we've been doing at this point to really envision a big picture, long range vision for the Caltrain corridor and system, looking at the future of the service, the kinds of infrastructure we may need to build in the long term, thinking about what changes to the railroad mean for the communities we run through. And as part of that work, we were starting to look at equity and connectivity, and we were getting ready to really finish the plan up over the course of the summer. But that was really the moment that sort of COVID hit. And as a result, we've paused that work and pivoted the business plan efforts, as well as some of the analysis and venues we've been using toward COVID recovery planning. There are a number of different parts to that recovery planning. We're doing some long-range scenario planning, a lot of service planning and financial analysis. But one of the most important parts, which is really the subject of the presentation and the meeting today, is the development of an equity, connectivity, recovery, and growth framework. And I'll talk about what that is as we go through this, and I'll also provide some background analysis and information from the business plan work that talks about why we're making some of the recommendations we are and where this process came from. As I mentioned, this is work we had been doing as part of the business plan. So we were already working on an equity policy. We were already looking at connectivity. But in the context of the COVID pandemic, as well as sort of the really national and international, in some cases, calls for racial justice and social equality that we've seen, we felt that it was important to take that analysis and really try to accelerate it a little bit and to create a policy document that our board could weigh in on and potentially adopt. And again, this work has been done in the context of the business plan, where although it's a long-range vision for the system, it's also about the different paths we can take to get to that long-range vision. And so with the pandemic landing in the middle, it's provided really an opportunity, but also a real need for us to look at how we can take some of the work we've been doing and some of the longer term thinking about how to improve the system and put it into practice a little bit earlier than we had thought. So the next section of the presentation, I'll go relatively quickly through this, really just recaps some of the work that had been going on in the business plan to provide a little bit of context. And I think the important thing to understand for folks who haven't been following this process is that the recommendations that we'll talk about in the policy didn't just come out of thin air. They were based on a lot of analysis that we've been doing, a lot of interviews and discussions with stakeholders. And to that point, some of it was very focused on the train system itself and looking at the data of our riders as well as surrounding communities. But we also did an extensive set of conversations and interviews with community groups and leaders up and down the corridor. And we anticipate doing more of that kind of work in the future. And when we started the equity assessment, really kind of early or late last year, rather, sort of pre-COVID, we were looking at equity for several reasons. And the work I'll show in the next few slides really talks about some of the findings in that work and why we were focused on it. But the reasons we felt at that time it was important to look at equity were, one, that we had heard that it was important to look at. As we were going through the business plan process, there was a consistent set of comments from our board and stakeholders that doing an equity analysis and bringing equity sort of concepts and goals into the plan process was important, and we took that feedback seriously, and so we incorporated it into our process. We also wanted to look at equity because Caltrain is planning to grow. We're in the midst of electrifying the system right now, and our long-range service vision had called for tripling the system's ridership. To do this, we really need to grow by attracting everyone, not just white-collar commuters, but really making sure that we're providing a system that's accessible, useful, and attractive to all kinds of different communities and useful for all kinds of different trip purposes. And this point, I think, is even more true now, post-COVID, than it was at the time. And then finally, and this remains true as well, Caltrain will need investment. We need investment today. We're running out of money, but we're also going to need investment if this system in the corridor is going to maintain its full potential in the long term. And as part of that, focusing on equity and, again, making sure that the system is attractive and useful for really everyone is an important part of that equation. And so when we did our equity assessment earlier in the year, we started by reviewing a lot of existing plans, particularly community-based transportation plans that were done really within the last couple of decades and related to communities along the corridor. We also engaged, as I mentioned, with a number of community leaders and groups up and down the corridor through kind of detailed written surveys, in-person interviews, phone interviews, to try to get a range of direct feedback from folks about why they or their communities maybe didn't use Caltrain, or how the system could be made more accessible or more welcoming to them. And we heard a few things through those processes. So some of the things that were emphasized in terms of the feedback were certainly better service for non-traditional work schedules and non-work trips. So Caltrain operates a very kind of traditional peak hour commute-oriented service, and we heard that that wasn't quite getting it done for many people. Certainly heard a lot about more frequent service to stations, that we weren't quite at the frequencies that enabled some people to make the trips they wanted to make. We heard about opening stations in communities of concern, particularly in Oakdale Station in San Francisco. We heard interest from North Fair Oaks in San Mateo County around a potential station. We heard a lot about better connecting bus service, and so there was a feeling that maybe the surrounding bus systems didn't really connect with Caltrain the way they needed to, and that's certainly something we've observed as well. Better bike and pedestrian connections, low-cost modes of access to the system were also an area where we heard about improvements. Better rider information, so making it really easy and intuitive for people, particularly people whose first language maybe isn't English, to access the system. Accessible station design was also something that was touched on. And then certainly we heard a lot about fares, discounted fares for low-income riders, and I'll touch as I go through this presentation on some of the other fare-related feedback we've heard. We've also heard sustained interest in advocating for additional affordable housing near Caltrain stations. Based on what we heard from the stakeholder interviews, we also did a lot of data analysis. And so we looked at census data, we looked at Caltrain's own rider data to kind of answer some key questions about Caltrain and whether Caltrain is really fully representative of the communities it traverses. And so a few points that are worth noting. One is that the Caltrain corridor is very diverse. We run over 70 miles between San Francisco all the way down to Gilroy. Caltrain owns the corridor from Tamian and South San Jose up through San Francisco. About 20% of the households along the corridor are located within a MTC designated community of concern. About 29% of those households are low income with an annual income of less than $50,000. And about 63% of the residents living within a 2-mile area of Caltrain stations are identified as people of color. When we look at those demographics compared to the demographics of the people who ride Caltrain today, there is a mismatch. Caltrain riders are on average wealthier than the folks who live within 2 miles of the station. And Caltrain riders are on average more white and Asian than the overall population living around the stations. And so that observation provokes another series of questions, which was, is there some inherent difference between the travel patterns of lower income communities or communities of color that would cause Caltrain maybe to not be as interesting a service to them? And we were also interested in looking at demographics on parallel transit routes to understand whether different groups of folks were choosing different travel options or just traveling in fundamentally different ways. And so to do that, we looked at census data, and we again looked at the whole Caltrain corridor. In this instance, we looked at corridor commute trips. So everyone traveling sort of within the corridor, into the corridor, out of the corridor. We were looking at regional trips, so we excluded trips that started and ended in the same city. Caltrain is fundamentally a regional service. Our average ride is about 20 miles long. And what we found is when we look at just commuters, Caltrain ridership does closely match all commuters within the corridor. And so that was an interesting finding, that when we look at people who are making work trips in the corridor, those folks from an income standpoint look very similar to the population of Caltrain riders. And interestingly, we also found that low income commuters have pretty similar commute patterns to higher income commuters, that when we look at commuters commuting into the corridor or along the corridor or out of the corridor, we don't see major differences across income levels. And so what we find is that Caltrain riders are pretty similar to the commuters who live in the corridor and who make work trips in the corridor, but again, we're pretty different from station area residents. And so one of the things that started to tell us is that Caltrain is doing a pretty good job of capturing a representative sample of the work market along the corridor. It's really a lot of the non-work trips or maybe non-census work trips that we're not doing such a great job at capturing. And so to see, again, where some of those folks might be riding, we wanted to turn to our parallel transit services and look at the demographics of their riders. And so we looked at a subset of routes for both Muni, Samtrans, and VTA. These aren't their whole systems. These are routes that parallel significant portions of the Caltrain corridor. And what we found there is that on parallel transit routes, low-income riders and people of color were more highly represented than they are on Caltrain, and they're really very highly represented compared to the area as a whole. And so again, some pretty distinct differences there. And one of the things that's particularly interesting to us and instructive in terms of thinking about some changes we could make was, when you look at the graph on the left, what you're seeing is the frequency of services throughout the day. And so Caltrain is in red, and you can see it's very peaked, where most of our services occurring during commute hours, and we drop way down in the middle of the day. Versus parallel bus routes, whether they're Muni, Samtrans, or VTA, where their service goes up in the morning and it stays pretty consistent throughout the day before coming down. And that's interestingly mirrored in the ridership we see on the systems, where Caltrain's ridership is as peaked as its service. Most people are riding our system, again, to get to or from work, and they're doing that at traditional commute times. When we look at sort of the volume of ridership on parallel transit routes, what we see is it's really kind of one big hump throughout the day. And so that starts to, the combined set of analysis from the stakeholder interviews, the plan reviews, and some of the demographic analysis starts to get us to a place where we're able to think about some of the policy changes that might be important for Caltrain to make. And the first of those really gets to schedule and frequency, and the idea that Caltrain services is very concentrated in the peaks, very limited in the midday and evening hours, whereas some of the parallel transit services run much more consistently throughout the day. And so that there really is this group of people where the Caltrain service may not be as relevant to them as it could be. They're making trips during the middle of the day. They don't want to wait around for an hour. And we're just not providing the service at that time to make ourselves a useful part of their travel options. There's also a cost element to that. So Caltrain is generally quite a bit faster than a lot of the parallel transit services. We have our own dedicated right-of-way, but we are more costly. We have a zone-based fare structure, which means that your costs increase with the distance traveled. Many of the parallel systems use a flat fare, although some express buses may have a higher fare. But by and large, Caltrain is significantly more expensive than a number of the parallel bus routes. We also looked a little bit at fare structure. The slide's a little old, so it's actually been superseded. But At the time we started this analysis, Muni was the only parallel transit operator that was providing a low-income discount fare. Caltrain has now started participating in Clipper Start at a 50% discount. And so we're now offering a low-income fare as well. But historically, our fares have been high, and I sort of alluded to this at the start of the program, because we've really had to rely on the fare box to cover our operating costs. We also took a look at the details of our fare structure. And so in addition to sort of a one-way ticket, Caltrain offers a range of discounted passes. We have things like a monthly pass and a Go Pass, which is sort of our corporate bulk purchase program. And one of the things that was a little concerning to us as we dug into those is that the folks who are taking most advantage of some of our discount programs are by and large riders who are the highest income. And so while it's great that we offer these discounts, one of the things that is a little concerning to us is that they don't seem to be getting distributed in an equitable way. And so that's another area that gave us some pause as we look toward the future. Another area of the system where we look at equity is related to how people get to and from the station. When we look at station access by rider income level, there are some pretty significant differences. Our higher income riders are more likely to drive to the station or bike. We've got a robust set of people walking to the station across every income level, and that's great. But one of the things that did stand out to us is our low income riders in particular are much more likely to rely on transit connections. And so a major focus for us is to think about how we can improve those connections to other transit systems. Fares are certainly part of that. I'll talk about some of the other aspects of how we can improve connectivity as we go. But fares and the challenges associated with transferring between systems are difficult. So Caltrain does not offer a discount to folks coming from other systems. There are some folks who will receive a discount on other systems if they're a Caltrain monthly pass holder. But in general, there's not a lot of fare coordination that's happening today. And that creates a particular challenge if a lot of our lower income riders are having to use multiple systems to complete their trip. Finally, that connectivity to transit is also important, just because being a regional service, although we have a lot of stations, they are inherently going to be a little bit more spaced out. And so for people who have mobility challenges or may not have access to a car, having really high quality connections to local transit is important, because it really does allow those folks who may have fewer options around how they're making their trip to fill in the last mile. And so where this analysis left us right kind of when COVID came crashing down was that we were looking at a range of options for how to attract more low-income riders and provide a more equitable system, looking at things like expanding service during off-peak hours, offering a broader range of low-income fare products, thinking about how to generally evolve and simplify our fare structure, and expanding our investment in first and last mile. Just a few quick notes on connectivity, which is the other part of the work we were doing and is also covered in this policy. So just on connectivity in general, this graph shows how access to the Caltrain system has evolved over time. In general, we've got people coming to the system by a whole spectrum of different modes. A lot of folks who walk to the system were not quite as auto-oriented as you might expect. A huge number of people bike to Caltrain, which is great. But one of the things we were concerned about to look at over time is that the share of people coming to the system by transit has declined. And I just touched on the equity aspect of access, where we see different income levels using different modes. One of the reasons that Caltrain has had challenges with transit connections is that for a long time we've operated a service that is irregular, where each individual train has its own train number, and the service pattern varies significantly hour to hour, train to train. And so what that means is trains show up and depart from stations at different times. And that means it's very challenging to provide a high quality connection to local transit or even to another fixed rail system like the BART connection in Millbrae. Obviously, we've also got some challenges, as does the whole region, in terms of the level of integration and coordination between fare systems. And so as you can see on this slide, there are differences between each of the different systems that Caltrain connects with. And then as we look out to the future, we've been doing some thinking about really how we grow access on the system over time, thinking about the cost per passenger, both from a capital standpoint and an operating standpoint. And we're obviously modes like driving have a very high capital cost if we're going to keep building parking, whereas things like pedestrian connections or bicycling or even transit are relatively lower cost. Similarly, thinking about sustainability and how we can scale to accommodate demand, where again, driving is challenging. It's hard to build a lot more parking from a financial perspective, from a space perspective, and from a sustainability perspective. And so again, some of the work that was in progress when COVID hit and work that we've now taken to put a policy together. And so the next several slides really just cover what is in the policy framework. And so I'm sure folks are able to read. I'm not gonna sit here and read the words on the slide to you, but I will explain kind of the thinking behind the different sections. And so again, we've really crafted this policy so that even though we're pausing the business plan and having to deal with COVID, we really felt it was important that our board have the opportunity to adopt a policy statement that really emphasizes equity, emphasizes connectivity to other systems, and talks a little bit about how Caltrain can make sure that we're not forgetting the long term, even as we're working to recover from the current crisis. So the first section of the policy is guiding principles, and there really are three of those. The first one emphasizes the need for Caltrain to be focused on equity, that we're at a time when transit is truly an essential service, and that we have a responsibility to work to enhance equity on the system and make sure that we're prioritizing the needs of folks who really do need our service to get around. Second is emphasizing that we are a link within a larger network. We're part of the Bay Area's passenger rail network. We're part of the overall regional transit system. And so we have both an opportunity and a responsibility to undertake policies and actions that enhance our role as part of that network. And then finally, this idea that, again, we're going to have to make a lot of decisions as we're dealing with recovery planning and dealing with the aftermath of the COVID crisis, and that we have the ability to make those choices in a way that's mindful of our longer term plans for growth. The second section of the policy addresses equity specifically. And the first section there is about equity and service. And so it states that we will undertake service planning and service changes in a manner that enhances equity and access for underserved communities and markets, including people with lower incomes and members of racial and ethnic minority groups. I do want to emphasize Caltrain is fully compliant with applicable federal laws, including Title VI. This is really about what we can do sort of at an even more affirmative level to go beyond that. One of the biggest things we think we can do, which I touched on, is number one, which is improving our midday and off-peak service levels. That sounds like a fairly simple thing, but it's fundamental to really transforming ourselves from a commuter rail into more of a true regional rail system. Second, we want to consider social and racial equity as a significant factor as we think about restoring service or expanding our service. Again, this is going beyond just the minimal amount and thinking about how it's something we can really incorporate deeply into our planning. Third is engaging in further research, dialogue, and planning to understand how to provide meaningful connections and access to communities that have historically been underserved. We know that there are communities that are interested in stations along the corridor in Oakdale, potentially in North Fair Oaks and San Mateo. We know that communities in South San Jose and south of San Jose down to Gilroy would like to see more service. And we want to prioritize doing the work to look at those options. This is not promising an outcome. There are some very real challenges with adding stations to the Caltrain line. There's some incredibly real challenges with increasing service south of San Jose on a corridor that Caltrain doesn't own. But we've heard the requests, and we think it's important that Caltrain prioritize really undertaking the analysis and explaining transparently what is and isn't possible. And then finally, we want to look at incorporating an equity lens into our access planning, particularly as we think about ways to improve access for everyone. Next, we looked at equity and fares. And so this is looking at the steps we can take to ensure that Caltrain is an affordable system and that our fare policies are equitable. This is a challenging one, in that I would love to make statements in here saying that we're going to lower our fares and really provide access to everyone. The difficulty is we just do not live in an economic model right now where that's possible. And so what we've tried to do here is say as much as we can and commit to the things that we know we can do. I think we'd like to do more in this regard, but there are really some real financial challenges Caltrain is facing in terms of our ability to kind of cut fares in mass. So the first option we're looking to pursue is to seek board approval to temporarily suspend implementation of fare increases that were previously approved. We don't want to increase fares in a pandemic, and we do have approved increases on the book. So if we don't go back and take board action to that effect, we'll effectively have to increase fares, and we don't want that to happen. The second is affirming Caltrain's ongoing support for regional means-based fare programs. So the Clipper Start program, we're participating actively in that. Our board recently took an action to increase the discount from 20% to 50%. And so we want to work to make sure that that program is successful and do everything we can with MTC and other operators to enhance its reach. Third, we want to accelerate some of the fare analysis that was called for in our 2018 fare study. Specifically, we want to take a good look at the Go Pass, our corporate deep discount program, as well as our other discount programs like our monthly pass, and see if there are ways that we can evolve those programs or tweak them to really ensure that when we're offering discounts, those discounts are going really to everyone, not and are being skewed in a way that's maybe favoring a certain group of folks. Finally, as part of that, we know that there are other aspects of our fare system that are worth a look. There are a number of folks who really are not a fan of the zone-based system we have. And so that would be something that we would consider as part of this work. Finally, there are some fare issues that really are outside of Caltrain's domain, but where we can participate in moving them forward. One of those is regional fare coordination. So there's a regional study going on around fare coordination, and we want to participate that and really advocate for outcomes that help riders make trips across all systems without penalizing someone just because they're using a different color bus or a train. Finally, we want to look at equity in planning and communication. And so the first of these is really acknowledging there is a lot more work for us to do. This is an equity policy that, again, was developed out of this work we were doing as part of the business plan, but there are certainly areas of the policy that need to be fleshed out and expanded. And so Caltrain has a lot of planning and research and dialogue to do to really understand how we can improve and expand access to a range of folks. Second really gets to our communications and looking at how we can improve our outreach processes, our marketing materials, down to our customer information systems to make sure that they're not just meeting but exceeding minimum standards and are really welcome and intelligible and intuitive to folks from a really broad spectrum of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And then 3 is to develop some detail and standards and measurements around the work we're doing, so that we say things like low income, we're able to start putting better definitions to that. When we say things like equity, we're able to put more specificity around what that means. And so that we can track our progress and be held accountable by our board and by the public. The next section of the policy focuses on connectivity. It's a little briefer. And so really this lines out several actions that Caltrain can take to improve connectivity with the rest of the region's systems. The biggest one of these, again, sounds simple, but it's fundamental, is to plan for a standardized clock face schedule where we arrive and depart consistently from stations. That really is essential to providing sort of the transit spine that other systems, whether they're shuttles or buses or light rail transit, can mesh with. If we're arriving and departing at irregular times, we're always going to be very challenged in our ability to effectuate those transfers. The second is the prioritization and coordination of major intermodal transfers within our service planning. Today, Millbrae, the BART connection at Millbrae is really the biggest key intermodal transfer in our system, but there are significant connection points in Santa Clara County with the light rail and in San Francisco with Muni and light rail as well. C, we want to really build on the coordination that's already happening between the operators. There's more coordination than I've ever seen going on right now as we're all kind of scrambling to deal with the impacts of COVID. And I think the silver lining to that is we are all talking to each other and working with each other, and we want to build on that and make sure that we're maintaining those relationships as we go forward. Finally, again, sort of a reciprocal policy around the fare issue is considering ease of transfers as we develop our fare policy, working with the region and working with the state on their fare programs to try to ensure, again, that we're doing everything we can to really encourage people to take trips that use different operators or multiple operators, and certainly are not penalizing them. The final part of the presentation deals with growth and recovery. And again, the theme of this is that although we are kind of really have our heads down right now and we're trying to get through a crisis, we are inherently going to make choices that are either going to enable or make more difficult the fulfillment of our long-term plans. And so we're taking the long-range service vision that our board adopted last year and saying that as we're able to, and as is practical and supported by market demand and the railroad's financials, we really should be trying to implement as much of that really as we can. And it's important to note that long-range service vision is not a project. It is a statement about the kind of service we want to operate, and there are many ways that we can start operating some of that service sooner. The second part is really to say that we do want to continue to think about the next phase of our growth. We're building the electrified system now, but these things take a long time to plan, and so we want to continue to look beyond that and think about what it would mean to grow further. We think that's an 8 train per hour per direction peak service between San Francisco and San Jose with a fully electrified system. And then as many improvements south of San Jose on the chunk of the corridor that Union Pacific owns as we can make based on the ownership constraints of that corridor. In the next section, we describe the kinds of capital investments that would be needed for that growth. That includes the full electrification of the main line between San Francisco and San Jose, track and system improvements, the provision of level boarding at Caltrain stations. And I do think that as I revise this policy, we'll likely call level boarding out more specifically as not just here, but also as in relation to the kinds of investments Caltrain can make that would improve equity by providing really greatly improved ADA access throughout the system. And then finally, the enhancement of Caltrain stations and access facilities. And finally, just this is in some ways less directly related to the specific topic, but important for Caltrain to keep saying. We're talking about these policies that are kind of a little bit more focused on the Caltrain system, but there are elements of our long range vision that are still very active and where we're working very hard with our partners to advance them. And that nothing in this policy suggests otherwise. And so that includes working with San Francisco on the downtown extension, working with San Jose and Santa Clara County on the reconstruction of the Diridon station, working with the state and high-speed rail to look at electrification south of San Jose down to Gilroy, working generally with high-speed rail, and then working on grade separations up and down the corridor. So the policy very much in draft, and we're pushing it hard because we do think that this is an urgent issue, and it's important that Caltrain and its board go on the record. So we're doing a whole bunch of outreach this month, and really, again, appreciate everyone who's attending the meeting tonight. We would encourage you, if you can, to provide comments tonight or to send them in via email or writing. Our hope is to make revisions to this policy and take it to our board for their consideration in August. And there's links and ways you can send feedback.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sebastian, and thanks everybody who's tuned in. So right now we're just going to go into sort of a Q&A or comment period. So again, if you have any comments or sort of questions about our equity framework or plan, now is the time. So you can either use your raise hand function on Zoom if you're on a computer, or if you're calling in, you can press *9 and that will also raise your hand. So it looks like we have Rich Hedges, so I'll allow to talk. I think if you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So thank you for this presentation. I thought it was very good, very comprehensive. I know we have some great challenges. One of the things that Samtrans did is a move toward equity is they allow for transfers now. And that, in fact, could end up hurting Caltrain's ridership, because now I can take the 250 or the 251 bus from the east side of San Mateo to El Camino and go north or south on Samtrans without paying an extra fare. In the past, it was only, I think, a quarter more for me to jump on Caltrain and take it north or south. So a good equity move may actually limit some of the Caltrain riders for people that are short on cash. One of the major things we need to look at as a region, Caltrain would be very much involved in this, is a regional fare. Other areas that I travel in, and actually in LA, I have one of their tap cards, I can buy a regional fare for the day. And it makes it so much easier to travel on transit. And especially here in the Bay Area, where you have 27, depending on how you count, or 29 transit agencies that you have to adjust for. I'm constantly on my iPhone coming from San Francisco, trying to figure out which the best mode of transportation to get me closest to my house. If I could clock that with a regional fare, I could also figure out that whether it would be cheaper to use the regional fare or to use the local fares. So for now, that's what I have to say. I want to be involved very much in this process. I think it's a long time coming and very good that it's happening now. Sorry it's happening at such a stressed time. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.
All right, if anybody else has a question, yeah, you could just go ahead and put it in the Q&A box or raise your hand on Zoom. Looks like we have one question submitted. If just sort of not explicitly equity related, but I guess we can answer electrification progress on that project. So right now we're able to sort of take advantage of some extended work windows. We're able to single track in some of the stations where electrification is happening. So the current service issues are not affecting that project. looks like we have one more question from Dave. I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Okay, you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, quick question. I know there's obviously a issue within, I think this is the case with Santa Clara County and as well as, I guess, San Francisco County about this, well, particularly San Francisco with this 1/8% sales tax increase. And I'm a little bit confused on exactly what the situation is with that, because I know one of our supervisors didn't want to put it on a ballot. And I'm trying to remember exactly the reason why. And I thought maybe it's because San Francisco County would not be in a position to participate as far as certain issues and decisions made by Caltrain. Can you clarify that? I don't know. I heard that was the reason, but then the media sort of mentioned another reason. So I'd like to see if you can get a clarification in regards to this sales tax, 1/8%.
Sure.
It's not very much.
So let me provide what clarification I can, noting that I'm staff, and so I'm going to try to not provide any sort of political perspective on it. So for several years now, there's been a piece of enabling state legislation called Senate Bill 797, which would authorize the Caltrain board to levy a 1/8% tax in the 3 counties that Caltrain operates. So San Mateo, San Francisco, Santa Clara. In order for the Caltrain board to have the ability to place that legislation on the ballot, they have to gain the approval of 6 other boards. And those other boards are the board of supervisors in each of the counties, as well as the boards of the transit agencies. So the MTA, VTA, and Samtrans. So that's the process that it's been going through. And that's the reason why the different boards of why this issue is coming up at the boards of supervisors, because they have to take actions to basically give Caltrain the authority to put it on the ballot. The issue, the basic issue that's caused some fractiousness lately is around the governance of the Caltrain system. So Caltrain is what's called a joint powers authority, meaning the system is sort of legally constituted and jointly owned by the 3 counties through the Peninsula Corridor Joint Powers Board. That's the legal entity that governs and owns Caltrain. And so that's a 9-county board. There are 3 members from each county on it. The system is managed by Samtrans, the San Mateo County Transit District. So I'm a Samtrans employee, Ryan's a Samtrans employee, and then we contract out our operations to a private company, TASI, Transit America Services Incorporated. And so there's been a sort of running set of questions or dispute among the 3 counties, and particularly at a political level, around whether the governance arrangement where you have a 3-county entity that is run at a staff level by one of the counties should persist, or whether as part of this sales tax, there should be a change to that arrangement. That's basically the root dispute. There's been a process ongoing to study governance of the Caltrain system that's been going on for over a year that our board has been involved in. But we're kind of at the point now where decisions have to be made one way or another to put the measure on the ballot. And so that's sort of the dispute that's playing out in at this point in the media. Hopefully that clarifies it. Again, I'm trying to not add too much color one way or another on it, because at this point it truly is a political issue.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sebastian. So right now, it doesn't look like we have any questions, but we're just going to launch another poll. So it should be popping up on your screen any second. Just, how you kind of thought about the meeting, what you think about the equity framework. Take a couple minutes to answer that. That'll just sort of help us. All right, so I'm going to close the poll out, share the results. So for those of you on YouTube, the question was, how do you feel the draft policy framework could change your Caltrain experience? 29% of you said improve it dramatically, which is great. 57% said improve it slightly, which is still great. Nobody said degrade it, so that's even better. And then, 14% said don't know. So this is all really helpful. And again, just everybody participating and sort of giving their feedback, giving their comments, will just strengthen our policy and will help our agency a lot. So again, just really appreciate, everybody showing up. And again, so we'll stick around if anybody has some more questions. You can continue to either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can send them in the Q&A box. If you have questions, maybe you want to spend a little bit more time on or comments, again, you can email equity@caltrain.com. And all that information is on our draft policy itself, which is caltrain.com/business plan. Looks like we got one more comment from Rich.
Yeah, I would just say that I've been a long-term fan of Caltrain, took it to college. When I was a very young guy here, broke, came from Kansas. I was on the first train out of San Francisco with Jackie when we launched this service. And I know that the reason we own this right of way is that San Mateo County ponied up the money for it. I would think that if governance wants to be shared at the level it's being requested, then there should be payments from those two counties in an equal amount for what the present day value is of the system. If they have skin in the game, then they get control. And if we could get those dollars, it would help us with the operation of Caltrain. That's my only comment on this so-called controversy that's going on now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rich. Looks like we got one more question maybe not. There was a hand raised and then immediately lowered. Oh, it's raised again. Okay, I'm going to go for it. Dave?
I think Dave is either still muted or.
Yeah, there we go. That's better.
Oh, okay.
The mouse slipped. I do apologize, gentlemen. Sorry about that. But anyway,
No problem.
I'm retired. I haven't ridden Caltrain for a long time, but I'm a rail buff. I've attended some of these electrification meetings, like in Burlingame. I think they had one down in Millbrae, Brisbane. I'm always interested in what's happening with electrification. And I'd go along, to tell you the truth, even though I don't ride it very often. I'd certainly go along with that particular item on the November ballot, for that sales tax increase, because if that's the case, then if I want to ride it, I can ride it. I know Caltrain is going to be there, and that would benefit all the commuters, especially after the pandemic clears up. Just want to make that comment, just for somebody who doesn't ride Caltrain hardly at all, but I love trains, and I would be more than happy to pay that additional sales tax increase here in San Francisco. That's it.
Thanks.
All right, it looks like we have one person on the phone. Again, if that person wanted to make a comment or raise their hand, they can press *9 and we can allow them to talk as well. If you don't want to make a comment, no pressure. All right, so we'll probably stick around for another 5 minutes in case anybody has a question. You know, you're thinking about asking it. Don't be shy, but stick around for another 5 minutes. All right, well, just wanted to say thank you again to everybody. Again, if you have any more sort of comments on the equity policy, you can email us at equity@caltrain.com. We're asking for comments by July 28th, so about about 7 days from now, so next Tuesday. You know, again, it would really help us, and again, really appreciate you sticking with us. But yeah, just want to thank Sebastian again for delivering the presentation. If you have any other questions, visit our site, check out our presentations. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.